Hello, Matt. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi Matt.
Excellent. Okay. Yes, you have two Matts today. So twice the fun, twice the fascination, I hope. And we're still just a touch early here. I think we're just about to hit 5:30 as I look at my watch. But we'll sort of make a soft opening here, Matt. I have the book in front of me, as you may have noticed a moment ago. And I will begin with a blurb that our own Jim Bell has added to the back of the book. Jim Bell, the just past president of the Planetary Society, who, of course, was our president for many, many years, a great Martian explorer, the guy that I call the Ansel Adams of Mars, and also a best-selling author. Here's what Jim had to say. Through a wonderful combination of scholarly, scientific research, and thoughtful humanist perspective, Shindell's For the Love of Mars provides a delightfully educational and entertaining history of our exploration of the red planet. And I couldn't agree more. So, Matt Shindell, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for including my book in your book club. It's a real honor.
We are very happy to have you. Here is a little bit of a bio for those of you who maybe haven't gotten to the back of the dust jacket on the book, and a couple of other little items that I've thrown in. Matt works at pretty much the most thrilling museum I have ever been to. He curates the National Air and Space Museum's collections of spacecraft, instruments, and other artifacts. He also co-hosts the Smithsonian's great podcast called What Else? Airspace. You can check out their May 11 episode about the red planet. It's pretty cool. Before he got to writing about our long cultural history with Mars, Matt wrote The Life and Science of Harold C. Urey, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist who eventually went to work at UC San Diego, where my daughters graduated. And you also spent some time, right, Matt?
Yeah, that's right. I was a grad student there, and that's essentially how I ended up writing about Harold Urey. He was someone who I was fascinated by already, and when I dove into his papers there at UC San Diego, there was just such a wealth of material and stories to be told from his career that I decided that would be my first big project.
I think I told you that when we met at the Humans to Mars Summit from Explore Mars in Washington, D.C. last May, where you were featured speaker. You presented a great lunchtime presentation and also joined me for a live interview during the live stream from that 3-day conference, 3 full days this time. And I told you then that I would love to get you on the book club. But I mentioned that I was in Urey's former lab at UCSD and actually had one of the non-animate stars of your book. There's a picture of me holding with tweezers a little fragment of ALH 84001, Allen Hills 84001, that famous meteorite that came from the red planet to ours many years ago, that some people still believe had evidence of Martian life inside it. It was really a thrill, both to be in Urey's lab and to hold that little piece of rock.
Yeah, oh, that's great. I mean, we have a fragment of it at the Smithsonian as well, and getting the opportunity to see and to hold a piece of Mars like that, especially one that's been associated with the history of life, is pretty incredible.
I have to ask you, as I have asked your just past director of the National Air and Space Museum, did you ever take the opportunity as a high enough official in that place to look around and open up the Apollo 11 command module and have a seat?
Oh, no. um, yeah, I mean, I wish I could, but the closest we've gotten to that is, we opened it up back before the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11's historic landing, and had the opportunity to 3D scan the entire interior.
Wow.
So, the next best thing that you can get is the 3D scan that we made, that you can kind of, explore and see what that interior space was really like. And honestly, it is a very small space, larger than Mercury and Gemini, but still a very small space for 3 guys to spend that much time.
Certainly not a space that you would want to spend all of your time in on the way to Mars, but a very important step, if you agree with me, toward taking humans to the red planet, I think, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And back then, from the late '60s up through the early '70s, as Apollo continued, there were a lot of folks at NASA who felt like that should be the next logical step. That Mars would be the destination for the 1970s, and here we are now in the 2000s, still talking about the next 10, 20 years getting to Mars.
Yeah. It proved to be much more challenging than anybody suspected at the time. I mean, after all, we went to the moon. Why not go, what, 100 or more times further
Yeah.
up to Mars? And with this is, of course, an era that you also address in the book. But let me start with what you had to say up front in the book. And by the way, everybody out there, feel free to post your questions or comments for Matt about the book, your thoughts about it. I know I've been very grateful for all of you who have already shared your thoughts online in the member community. They are going to be relayed to me by the great Amber Trujillo, who is standing by, and I will see them pop up in a window next to me here. So I look forward to your participation as well. And I'm not sure why my watch is ringing, because I silenced it a while ago. I put it in theater mode. But anyway, if you heard that, my apologies. You said up front in the book that your whole approach to the book, your concept of what you wanted to do with the book, changed when we suddenly all got hit by the plague, the pandemic, back in 2020 or so. Talk about that. How did it change, and are you in any way glad or that it did?
Well, to answer the second part first, yeah, I am glad that the plan for the book changed, because I think I ended up writing a book that was more fun for me to write, in that it was an exploration of time periods that I didn't know as well as the 20th and 21st centuries, which, when I wrote the dissertation about Urey, and when I first started working at the museum as well, my focus, my expertise was mainly on that 20th century period. And with Mars exploration, I pushed that back to the 19th century, thinking about those early periods of attempting to map Mars. And so, the original plan for the book was basically going to be that. It was going to be thinking mainly about robotic exploration and how we've developed the view of Mars that we have today, and how we connect it to our life on Earth. But, as I was sitting at home during the pandemic, working from home, and, everyone else was as well, including colleagues at NASA. And I was watching the Perseverance rover launch, in 2020. And I saw that plaque on the side of the Perseverance rover, the memorial, or the tribute, I guess, to the frontline healthcare workers, that had, the medical staff, the Greek medical staff symbol, and then that image of the Earth showing, the North American and South American continents, and showing the trajectory that the rover was going to take in leaving Earth orbit for Mars. And I thought, that's an incredible combination of symbols, right? Here you have this ancient symbol that represented a very different idea of health and how it was to be maintained and achieved, with an image of the Earth that people from that era would not have recognized, because they had no idea about North and South America, right? Their world was much smaller than the world we know today. And I started thinking, what would they have thought about a mission to Mars, and how would that have related to their view of the world and their view of life? And so that really initiated a lot of the thinking for the book, that I thought, well, if I can tell a story about how we think about Mars today, and how it's become part of our lives and our ways of thinking about ourselves and our future, can we tell those same types of stories about periods in the past? And, as I was doing the research, I realized that you could tell very meaningful stories about how people related Mars to their lives and their times during these different time periods and in different places around the world. And that by doing that, you could actually tell an even more meaningful story about our time now and how it is part of this history of connecting Mars to ideas about ourselves and our relationships to the world and to the universe.
I, for one, am very glad that you expanded the scope that way, looking back really to the very beginnings of civilization and how our concept of Mars and how what our relationship with Mars has been really right from the start, the ancient Assyrians and the like. I'm also glad that you put Mars in context. It's not exclusively the red planet. You pretty much by necessity, I would think, had to talk about our concept of the cosmos that was held by the entire cosmos that was held by these other civilizations, these previous civilizations.
Right, because even today, even though Mars is a world in and of itself with its own history and it is a world unto itself, it's still a part of a larger cosmos today. But it was even more so that, I think, in previous eras where it was part of sort of either an intelligent machine or a divine creation, and it played a role in the life of the greater world. So it was part of a world as opposed to its own world, and so necessarily you needed, for those early periods, a lot of context to make sense of what people saw when they looked at Mars.
So divine creation, but in my reading it seemed that kind of came a little bit later. Mars is a tool of the deity of God, if you will, but initially Mars as one of the gods. I mean, not just sort of representing the ancient Roman version of Ares, but just it was a god itself and had, I guess, its own personality and way of thinking and wanting to influence us.
Yeah, and you can understand, I think, why not just the ancients, but even earlier than that, prehistoric sky watchers might have thought that about Mars, because it does seem different from the other planets that you're able to observe in the sky, in that it behaves in ways that seem very eccentric or idiosyncratic, right? It can change brightness, it can change size, it can change color,
retrograde motion, which you talk about.
Yeah, it can change direction, and when it does that, it doesn't always do it in the same way. It depends on where it is in its elliptical orbit in relation to us at the time that we go into opposition. So, I think people observing Mars over a long period of time would have seen all of these differences and started to think that Mars maybe had a mind of its own, in a way that a lot of other things in the sky don't really seem to have that.
It's that evolution from that kind of thinking to, I think you talked about the Greeks taking a half step away from the deification of Mars and the other planets. And it is kind of a steady progression or an evolution, can't you say?
I mean, you can look at it that way. I think there's a lot of discontinuity as well. But yeah, when the Greeks, especially Plato and then Aristotle, start to think about the structure of the cosmos, that's very different from what other ancient civilizations had done, in that they had thought more about the purpose and the meaning of the cosmos as opposed to the geometric structure, the way that Plato and Aristotle did. And as they did that, they really made the deliberate choice to break from that tradition of thinking of the planets in relation to gods, and instead thought, let's come up with, well, in Plato's case, when he wrote the Timaeus, he basically said, let's think about a likely story of how the universe might have been created, knowing what we know about the universe and how it works. And so he's really, I think, one of the first people who said, let's step back and think about what we know and how we could construct a view of the universe based on that, as opposed to let's think about the purpose. But I think it's a half step, like you said, in that they still inserted a lot of meaning and purpose into that system. And especially when, in the medieval world, whether it was Jewish, Islamic, or Christian scholars who were discovering those texts and interpreting them, they inserted purpose right back into them. And they made it a machinery through which God was acting on the world, right? So it got a lot of that divine purpose back in the end.
Another form of retrograde motion, I think.
Yeah.
There was one particular episode toward the end of what we now call the medieval or Middle Ages. Once upon a time, a lot of people called the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
This example of a 14th century rite for removing worms from a garden by invoking the Holy Trinity, acting through the sun, moon, other planets, and the stars. So agents of God, if not gods themselves.
Yeah, and that came to this sort of, or came from this belief that, God didn't act directly from heaven. God used the machinery of the universe in order to enact his will, and that will had essentially been pre-programmed into the universe from the beginning. And so God knew when these things were going to be necessary. That didn't mean you still didn't have to ask, right? As human beings, you still had to do your part to be good Christians or Jews or Muslims. But God had essentially known what would happen from the beginning to the end, and had programmed that all into that that world machine, that very, very intelligently designed and divine world machine.
I'm going to come back to that when I bring up Isaac Newton, but I got to mention there are these other little sidelights throughout the book that are really delightful, that just caught my eye and my imagination. You mentioned a device that was created in Baghdad around the 9th century. It said it was called the Equatorium, that had knobs on it, I guess, and you could use it kind of like a little planetarium, or oh God, what's the word I'm trying to think of? The solar system model. Oh man, it's
Oh, the
escaping.
orrery.
The orrery, yes, of course. Sounded kind of like that. I've got a model of one behind me right here on the bookshelf, given to me by my good friend, our chief scientist, Bruce Betts. The Antikythera or Antikythera device, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which is thought to have been the same kind of mechanical device for describing the movement of the celestial bodies. I mean, this was so far ahead of what was happening in Europe at the time, right?
Yeah, and that's why you see in the Islamic world, and even before that, in earlier periods in Africa, the development of these incredible instruments that then got adopted in Europe. Going back to the astrolabe, right? These essentially handheld replicas of the universe, and means of calculating and predicting the positions of stars and planets. They're really incredible devices for how few moving parts they actually contain. That device that you mentioned, whose name I can never pronounce, is an exception in that it is like so incredibly complicated and geared and fine-tuned to predict those motions. But mostly people were dealing with things that were handheld or held hung by strings, and the fact that they could use those so reliably to observe and know what they were looking at in the night sky really is incredible, thinking about how much difficulty I have doing it now in the 21st century.
Me too. Thank God for computerized telescopes.
Yeah.
You made me think. I was listening to that episode of your airspace podcast, and you mentioned Dante and Dante's Inferno, and there were references to Dante in the book. For example, this Christian reinterpretation of the universe as conceived by Aristotle and Ptolemy, really adopting at least a portion of that thinking from far earlier to Christian dogma or theology, which was also fascinating. I mean, this dance between science and religion in all their forms.
Yeah, and Dante himself was an incredibly educated person. He had been educated in the sciences and the humanities, and then of course he was raised as within medieval Christian schools, and so he was also a very devout Christian. And what's really incredible, I don't talk that much about the Inferno in this book, but of course the Inferno is the book that everyone reads in high school. If you read Dante, you usually read the Inferno. Maybe you read a little bit of Paradiso, but what's really incredible is the way that Dante, not only does he find a way of kind of using the the spheres that Aristotle and Ptolemy had set out for the structure of the heavens in order to tell the story of how he travels through those to meet God. But he also inverts that story and creates this mirror of that view of the cosmos in the interior of the earth when he imagines what hell is like. And I love the way that he mirrors those two things, in that when he goes down through the circles of hell, he is seeing the different vices that brought people to hell. And of course, telling a lot of stories about famous historical figures as he does so. But then as he goes up into the heavens, he decides that, what you're going to encounter there are the virtues that get you into heaven as opposed to the vices that bring you to hell. And so he's faced with this, problem as an author, not necessarily a bad problem to have, where he has to figure out how he's going to associate those virtues with planets. And I love what he does with Mars, because Mars has for so long, historically at that point, been associated with bad things, with disease, with famine, with war, and so he has to figure out, well, how am I going to make that into a virtue? And I love what he does. This is me imagining what Dante's thought process is, by the way, is he decides it's going to be the virtue of fortitude. And the way that's going to be expressed is through martyrs, people who've died for their religion, or people who went to holy war. So he takes death and he takes war and he turns it into something good by focusing on martyrs. And of course, the ultimate martyr in his mind as a medieval Christian is Jesus Christ. And so as he gets to Mars in the Paradiso, what he sees is this giant cross being illuminated by the souls of the martyrs whose souls inhabit that sphere. And they're putting on essentially a fireworks show in front of him. And it's one of the most dramatic scenes in the entire Paradiso, but until he finally gets to the Imperium and meets God, and that's sort of the climax of the story. But before he does that, Mars is really this very important part of the narrative, where he essentially is confronted by all of these people, including his own relatives, who made the ultimate sacrifice for their religion. And so Mars becomes this very incredible or very important spot for Dante as he makes his way to heaven. So I had to include that in the book because I love that so much. Just the work that he did as an author to make that into a meaningful moment.
I noted that shift in this image of Mars to something much more benevolent, fortitude, and that was nice to read after reading for identifying Mars as the god of war for so long. Before I go on, here is a question. And by the way, once again, if you've just joined us, we are talking with Matt Shindell, of course, the author of For the Love of Mars, our choice for the Planetary Society member community book club this week. Highly recommended. If you haven't read it, I hope we are intriguing you and teasing you a little bit. And you can post your questions where you are watching right now in the member community in the chat area. And here is one from Luis Rodriguez, who asks, in the book, you mentioned the medieval understanding that there was some relationship between anatomy and the cosmos, Zodiac Man from 15th century German manuscript. In your research, what did you find most interesting about Mars's meaning, or that of maybe of any of the other planets, in relation to human anatomy?
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating stuff. And it comes down to this belief in the mind of medieval Christians. And some of this comes from earlier Greek thinking, not just from Aristotle, but also from later on in Rome, Ptolemy and the physician Galen. This idea that the body was essentially a small version of the world or of the cosmos, that what everything out in the universe was the macrocosm, and then the body was this microcosm that reflected everything that was happening outside of it. And so medieval Christians, Jews, Muslims, all of them believed that there was this influence that the planets had on things that would happen on Earth. Essentially, they believed that all change on Earth, all combinations of things, all combinations of the four elements, earth, water, air, fire, were made possible by the motions of the planets. That the planets were the forces that were combining things and pulling things apart. And if the planets were to stop moving, then all things on Earth would freeze. There would be no more change. There'd be no corruption, there'd be no death, but there'd also be no creation and no birth. So imagining that the cosmos somehow stopped would be like imagining the world ended. And so when you think about that in terms of the body, if you're already imagining that the planets have an influence on say the metal ores that are being formed inside of the earth, or the vapors that are coming up out of the earth, or the tides in the case of the moon's influence, then you can then imagine that they're going to have the same effect on the human body if it is this micro version of the cosmos. And so, if Mars was in the wrong place in the sky, in that it could, bring up foul vapors from the interior of the Earth, then it could be doing that to a part of the body. And there were various different parts of the body and illnesses of those parts that were associated with Mars. The moon was a really important celestial body when it came to thinking about when you wanted to use leeches or to bleed someone as a remedy. So in addition to the planets telling you why someone might be sick and what their illness might be, the movement of the planets and the moon and the sun could also tell you what treatment they might need, when they might need it, and when was a good or a bad time to seek medical help. Because there were also times when the stars were aligned in such a way that doctors would be ineffective. So, there were all kinds of ways that the stars and the planets could affect your health and your ability to recover from illness. And I found that entire story fascinating. I don't know if there was any one part of it that stood out to me, but I just love this idea of this intimate connection between the body and the world, in that they are it's not just that the body lives in the world, it's that the body is a version of the world.
Luis, thank you for generating that terrific response from Matt. Here is a total shot in the dark, not from the book. You mentioned the four elements, the four ancient elements: earth, fire, air, water. Could they have had any relationship to the four bodily humors? I mean, yeah. Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So there was considered to be a relationship between the elements and the humors, in the sense that I think, this idea that rationally they would have some connection. I can't remember off the top of my head what the actual connections were, but just in the same way that, for example, water was considered to be warm or cold and wet.
Yeah.
Earth was considered to be warm and dry. The humors had similar properties as well. And so if you changed the properties of the humors, you could change one humor into another and achieve balance. So it was very much the same kind of physics, if you will, that was going on with the humors that was happening with the elements as well.
And then there's the fifth element, which you talk about in the book. And prior to reading the book, my entire concept of the fifth element was shaped by Bruce Willis.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And a movie that I highly recommend, The Fifth Element. Really,
it's a wonderful movie.
It's a terrific movie. Yeah. But this idea that the fifth element is out there, not a part of us, the realm of heaven, right?
Yeah, that there's this entirely different realm that behaves a different way because it is subject to a completely different physics, because of the nature of the substance that it's made of. And that's, at the heart of Aristotle's physics, is that things behave the way they do because of their natures and the qualities that they contain. And so ether has its own set of natures and qualities that make it move in perfect circles, but that also make it so that, the sort of the earthly substances, everything that exists below the moon, can't enter that sphere, and vice versa. They're completely separate. And that lent itself very well to the idea that one realm is divine and the other realm is mortal and corruptible and imperfect. And so that very much shaped, of course, the medieval view of what life on earth was versus what life in heaven was, that souls and God could live out in the cosmos, but that for their time on earth, the human soul was imprisoned within a mortal body, and subject to all of the confusion, the chaos, and the corruptibility of the world, and sort of surviving that life and then making your way to heaven was the goal, right, of the Christian view, at any rate.
Taking your place on that procession
Yeah.
across the cross.
But there's
that
another
day.
part of it that I think is really kind of interesting, and I find it kind of inspiring, which, you know, goes back to Plato, but then is picked up again in the medieval era, which is this idea that, you know, yeah, the soul is confused, it's corrupted, it's, you know, subject to all of the, you know, the vices of living on earth, but it can regain some of its former dignity because it came from the cosmos before it came into the body. It has seen the order of the universe, it's just forgotten it. And so if you study astronomy, if you study the structure and the order of the heavens, you can regain that you know, original dignity that the soul had when it first entered the body. And so the study of astronomy becomes this incredibly you know, restorative act that can help you purify your soul. I love that idea.
That's wonderful. I mean, just the natural philosophy is the road to paradise. That's
yeah.
that's fascinating. I don't want to ignore the Copernican revolution and its significance, but turning to Galileo, who you mentioned was described by some of his contemporaries as sort of the cosmic Columbus.
Yeah.
His becoming the first person to see these wandering stars as globes, as discs, and to see that some of them even had their own little bodies circling around them, as he did with the Galilean moons. How significant was that change in changing our view, not just our view of the cosmos, but what it all meant to us, how it touched us?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about that Copernican revolution, you know, and what Galileo and Kepler were writing about in the early 17th century, and then if you add to that, you know, all of the discoveries that were being made on Earth, you know, in North and South America, that were defying the expectations and the pronouncements of a lot of ancient philosophers about where on Earth life would be possible and the extent of life. You know, essentially they were having their own argument about habitable zones back in that period after the discovery of North and South America by the Europeans. I shouldn't say discovery, the encounter with the Americas, because honestly,
Yes.
they didn't discover anything, right? They just hadn't known that it existed. And you know, if you add that then to Galileo looking at what were literally new worlds in the heavens, yeah, I mean, you do see that a lot of important changes are happening during this period. But I think what's also interesting is that, you know, even with Galileo's observations and Kepler's new theories and laws of planetary motion, the actual revolution is very slow in coming. It takes a long time before people are actually thinking about the solar system in anything close to the way we think about it today. You know, Galileo saw what he saw through the telescope and said, look, the moon looks a lot like Earth. It has a rough surface. It has surface features. And, you know, look, Jupiter has moons. It's not just a sphere of ether out there. It's possibly a whole world with, you know, other stars that orbit it. But even he didn't really know what he was seeing or how to explain it. You know, he tried to come up with explanations for how physically this would be possible, but wasn't really able to achieve that. And I love, you know, the Galileo's story and Kepler's story are great, but in that chapter, the story I really enjoyed telling was one of the guys who came after Galileo and Kepler, a Roman Jesuit priest named Athanasius Kircher. And so Kircher is writing in the wake of Galileo. He had come to Rome just after Galileo's trial. He had actually been born just before Galileo made his first observations with the telescope, and so he had kind of grown up as a Jesuit with the knowledge of the new astronomy. And so he came to Rome to teach mathematics and astronomy. And some have speculated that he was sort of a quiet Copernican, that in his heart he believed in a sun-centered universe, but on the page he never admitted it.
Good survival skill, considering.
Yeah, because coming to Rome at the time that he did, it probably wasn't the best time to have new ideas about the cosmos. But he decided to write a dream story. So he writes this story about falling asleep after a concert at the College of Rome. And after the concert ends, the musicians tune their instruments to more ancient tunings. They play something in the ancient mode, and he falls asleep and dreams of this journey where he's accompanied by an angel out into the cosmos. So a lot like Dante's trip into the heavens, but as he gets to the other planets and to Mars in particular, he's not experiencing it the way Dante did. Instead, he's experiencing a world, right? He comes to a world when he gets to Mars that he can set foot on. But what I love about it is that Kircher is, not thinking the way that we do about what planets are and the roles that they serve. He's still thinking of planets as parts of the world that humans inhabit. Their main purpose is still to influence things that are happening on Earth. And so when he gets to Mars, what he experiences is basically an overdose of the effects of Mars. He becomes very angry and angsty, and he wants to fight. And it's not until the angel gives him an antidote that he's able to set foot on Mars and not feel that way. And what he sees on Mars is something incredibly ugly and foul. It is a foul-smelling world made of tar and burning pitch. I mean, it's not a pleasant place to be. And that's based on his ideas of what would cause those bad influences that Mars has on Earth. And there's this wonderful moment, too, that really kind of echoes the book of Job in a way. At the end of the book of Job, God says, you can't really question why I do things because it's all for a purpose, and you will never know those purposes. Because, the main character of Kircher's story, who's named Theodidactus, which means taught by God. Theodidactus asks the angel Cosmiel, who's been his guide, he says, why would God create such a place? This is such a horrible place. What possible reason could there be for a beautiful and divine God to create something like this? And he says, well, didn't God also create all of these other wonderful planets? And don't they work with Mars to create the effects on Earth? Mars doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it serves its purpose. And, it's not your place to question how God works and why he would do such a thing. So it's a great moment.
A place for every purpose under heaven.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful story. And, if you haven't reached that point in the book yet, this was a great retelling of it that we just got from Matt, but it is also in the book. I have to say, it did occur to me that maybe Theo and Cosmiel took a wrong turn, thought they were on Mars, and was really Io.
Who knows? Yeah.
how stinky it was. I want to go on to, I said I'd go to Isaac Newton eventually, the guy who really maybe did more than anybody to turn the cosmos into a great clockwork, and gave us gravity, discovered gravity as if it hadn't always been around us. And yet he was still somebody who very much believed that there was a watchmaker behind it all, as of course many people do today.
Yeah, and it's really why Newton was willing to make that leap to think about the universe and the solar system as a place that would be full of emptiness. He was one of the first people to really think that it wasn't a plenum, right? It wasn't just an everywhere full sort of place. And he was able to make that leap because he said, hey, that empty space, that's God's sensorium. There's not anything physical there, but God is there. And God is giving the properties to objects that give them this gravitational relationship based on their mass. So he was very influenced by his Christianity and also by his alchemical practices, and he had studied alchemy very extensively. And so the way he thought about the property of gravity was very similar to how alchemists would think about the properties of different forms of matter. So, we think of Newton as being this incredibly modern guy who was able to see what everyone else didn't and bring us into the modern age. But he did so for reasons that were very particular to him and his view of God and of the nature of the cosmos. So, that's why I enjoyed telling Newton's story. Even though Newton doesn't do that much with Mars, he still gives us the universe in which Mars and the Earth can then kind of have the same family story, because they're now part of this completely physical, mechanical system where everything is obeying the same physics, as opposed to that Aristotelian view where you have the physics of the cosmos and then the physics of the sublunar world. Now everything is obeying the same physics, and it's all made out of the same stuff.
I promise to take us right back to Mars in a moment, but it does occur to me as you were talking about this from in Newton's mind, not that dissimilar from Einstein, who saw in the workings of this far more complex cosmos that he developed also the hand of his concept of God, which it's in so many of those wonderful quotes that we got from Albert.
Yeah. I have to admit, I haven't thought a lot about Einstein's view of God, but I know he did definitely see God at work in his view of the cosmos.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to jump forward a little bit to William Herschel, that great, sort of adopted British astronomer, who you said was the first to propose that there was this special relationship between Earth and Mars as worlds. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, Herschel is interesting because he approaches astronomy in a different way than I think other astronomers of his era or before. He thinks of stars and planets in a similar way to how biologists of the time would have thought about creatures living on Earth, that they have this kind of natural history to them. They have a story of how they're born, how they develop, and then how they die. And so he's looking at what he thinks are stars in different stages of development and birth towards death. Some of what he's actually looking at turns out are nebulae. But in his mind, these are stars in different stages of their lives. And he starts to think of planets not as something that maybe happened by accident, but as something that might happen in just the natural life of a star. And so the special relationship between Earth and Mars really is this idea that they've both been on the same development course, and that both would have developed sort of similar surfaces and possibly life as well. And that's not necessarily new to him, the idea that there would be life on the other planets. People during the Enlightenment were writing treatise after treatise and story after story of how all of the planets are probably inhabited, because nobody could imagine, well, not nobody, but a lot of folks couldn't imagine that God would create these worlds and not put life on them, because what would be their purpose if they didn't have life? And so Herschel, though, isn't thinking from that standpoint. He's thinking instead from this sort of naturalists or natural historians viewpoint of why Mars is probably populated, because it's followed those same rules. And Herschel was an interesting guy. Not only did he think that the planets were probably inhabited, he also thought that the sun probably had some form of life as well. And I don't know exactly how he came to that conclusion, but it was him that kind of inspired a lot of astronomers after him to think about this special relationship between Earth and Mars, and particularly later on, you get Lowell's ideas, which are based very much on this earlier Herschel idea.
And I was going to go to that period with old Percy next, but I do have another question here from Luis, and I'm going to come back to a topic apparently several of you have been asking about, including Craig Griffin, which has to do with your views, not about this book, but about Afrofuturism. So we'll come to that maybe at the end of the conversation. So here's the other one, another one of the ones that Luis asked about. I found it fascinating that Kepler struggled with Mars's irregular motion for years, eventually leading him to start thinking of orbits as elliptical. You mentioned that when he did expand on this idea, he focused on the moon. Is there any indication of him ever going back and writing about that, how this fit with his Martian orbit struggles? Did he extend these thoughts about elliptical motion farther out?
I'm not a Kepler expert, so I can't say for sure, but no, I don't think that he did. And the moon work that you're referring to is the Somnium that he wrote. And he wrote that actually over the course of his life. He wrote it in different forms and never published it. It wasn't actually published until after his death. So he never, at least publicly or in print, made connections between his imagined journey to the moon, which, by the way, was sort of a thought experiment to think about what would the Earth look like from the moon, and could you observe the motions that would indicate that the Earth revolved around the sun as opposed to the sun around the Earth. And it's a fascinating read if you haven't read it. It's an incredibly imaginative story that's semi-autobiographical, but it's also supposedly a dream that he had in which he was a different person. So it's a very, very fun read with a lot of footnotes, actually.
Isn't Kepler, because of this, one of the people credited with the invention of science fiction?
Yeah, I think that's maybe not quite right, because if we're going to credit Kepler with it, then why not credit Dante with it? And then there were people who were writing these types of narratives before Dante as well. But I think Kepler is maybe the first who wrote one of these imagined journeys where he really did it for a scientific purpose, where he was really trying to think through ideas about the relationship between the Earth and the moon and their motion around the sun.
All right, let's go to Percival Lowell and his Canali and what that wrought across civilization. It's not something you go into the sort of the scientific background, the thinking about the Canali, and actually that Schiaparelli kind of was thinking more closely along the lines that Lowell also did than I realized. I thought it was sort of a mistranslation. But one thing that you don't go into in great detail, which we've also talked about on Planetary Radio, is sort of the cultural hubbub that was generated by Lowell and others, at the turn of the 20th century. You do talk about the science fiction a little bit, H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's fair to say, isn't it, that at least the Western world went a little bit Mars mad during that period.
That's very true. And, it's important to kind of put it in context in that, the observatories of the time were, in some ways kind of like the big science of their day, right? It was almost like if a press release was coming out of an observatory, it was like NASA putting out a press release at the time. And this is also a time when the technologies of the telegraph, of the railroad, of the newspaper were making it possible for news to travel incredibly fast. And so you could send a telegram from the observatory up on the mountaintop in Flagstaff, and that could be on people's doorstep the next morning in the newspaper. And so if you are announcing canals on Mars and you're combining those with theories about the intelligent life that's living there and that's undergoing this incredible civil engineering project to keep their planet alive, then you're going to get a lot of headlines in newspapers. And another historian of science, Josh Knoll, he wrote a book that came out a few years ago called News from Mars that talks about that exact phenomenon and how Lowell and other astronomers at competing observatories basically were competing for newspaper space, and attempting to get their ideas and their theories out there and promote their observatory's work. And so, a lot of the effort to discredit Lowell and to make it seem that he was, an amateur, or that he didn't know what he was talking about, or that he had mistranslated Schiaparelli's original claims. A lot of that came from the competition that was trying to, promote their views over his. Now, I mean, we know that Lowell was wrong, and we know that he continued to think he was right longer than he probably should have, given the evidence that was out there. But the fact is that Schiaparelli did think that these canals could be artificial. He was agnostic about whether they were or weren't artificial. And Lowell wasn't alone in thinking that they were evidence of some form of life. And even for those who disagreed with Lowell about the canals being evidence of intelligent life, there was almost overwhelming consensus, I would say, in the astronomical community, that Mars was probably inhabited by some form of life. But opinions sort of varied between it having actual large life forms like what exist on Earth, or if it was more like, the high altitude ecosystems of the Earth where you just see small plants and maybe the occasional shrub or something. So, that's why when the first Mariner missions go to Mars in the 1960s, there's still a hope in the minds of a lot of folks that they're going to see green vegetation when they fly over Mars, because even if the canals don't exist, they still believe that there is some water there, and that some form of simple life, like maybe lichen, might live on the surface and might be responsible for those changes in albedo patterns that you see on Mars from season to season.
And this is very well documented. The history of robotic exploration of Mars is a big part of the book, and apparently kind of where you thought the book might be when you originally conceived of it. So not surprising that it's there, especially in view of your job at the National Air and Space Museum. But it's one of the things that fascinated me was this transition in the thinking, the scientific thinking about the exploration of Mars, from astronomical to geological, which we see continuing today, although now we also see very strong, welcome elements of biology or astrobiology.
Yeah, when Mars exploration first began, and I mean, when planetary exploration in general first began, it wasn't clear who would make the best planetary scientists. And one of the things I learned from diving into Yuri's papers is that he was very skeptical of geologists. He didn't feel like they had the training that was going to be suitable for looking at worlds other than Earth, because their entire science was based on observations of things that happen on Earth. And, who knew if those same processes were at work on the moon or on Mars. And so he felt like, geochemists like himself might be better suited, because they didn't have these same biases towards terrestrial processes. And, there was also, as we were saying, a strong contingent of biologists who thought that biology was going to be a very important science in studying Mars in particular. And then those early Mariner missions up through Mariner 9, when we got our first, global view of all of the features of Mars for the first time, really transformed Mars science and planetary science in general into a field that geologists came to dominate, because Mars was a world of rock. And, the amount of time we've now spent exploring Mars, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the exploration of Mars now defines the field of planetary science, but it's definitely a very large part, because of the amount of missions and the amount of scientists involved in those missions. And so, geology became a dominant force in in planetary science through that. I mean, not every planetary science is a geologist, but everyone has to know at least a little geology
Yeah.
to do planetary science. So yeah, and that's the period when that happens, is the 1960s into the early 70s. And part of that story is what we discovered when we got to Mars, but the other part of that story is the role that the US Geological Survey played in producing the first maps of the moon and then the first maps of Mars. And so, it was partly that relationship as well that was forged between NASA and the USGS. So that's a little bit of institutional history as opposed to straight history of science, but I think it's an important part of the story.
Yeah. I also want to thank you on behalf of the Planetary Society for giving our co-founder, Carl Sagan, his due in terms of particularly exploration of Mars. He
Yeah.
certainly was one of the first planetary scientists in the multidisciplinary sense.
Yeah, and he was this interesting figure who, he spent, I don't know about equal time, but he spent time as a student studying from Yuri. Yuri was one of his instructors when he was at Columbia or University of Chicago. I guess it must have been Columbia. And then, or no, it was University of Chicago. But then he also studied with astronomers like Kuiper. So he was someone who really was omnivorous about science. And he became kind of the poster child of what a planetary scientist should be, that they should be versed in multiple modes of doing science and of understanding the planets.
And one of the things that you surprised me in the book had to do with Carl. And it really takes us to the end of the book, and I don't want to finish yet. Do you have a few extra minutes?
Oh, no, we can go a little longer. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you. Because I do have some other questions I want to get to from some of our community members.
Yeah, of course.
And it has to do with Carl, and that I had no idea that I probably came across it in one of his books a long time ago and forgot that he had expressed concern about the fate of Mars as we humans gain access to it. And, because he was thinking of what we've done to our planet and to other living things on our planet. Fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, Carl Sagan was an incredibly thoughtful person, right? He wasn't just about asking and answering scientific questions. He thought about, the human dimensions and the political and the social implications of the science. And he had already before that point made connections between what we saw on planets like Venus, where we have the runaway greenhouse effect, and planets like Mars that have lost their atmosphere, to the potentials of human weapons of mass destruction in destroying life on our own planet. His idea of nuclear winter was very informed by what he saw looking at other planets and how those worlds may have changed over time, in some cases very dramatically. And so I think, when he was thinking about the potential impact of humans going to Mars and transforming Mars in different ways, he, I think, saw both the benefits and the downsides. And, his view on it was, if there's life on Mars, then leave Mars to the Martians. But if we can't find life on Mars, or if we don't think we've found life on Mars, then we still have a responsibility to go there and, not just destroy the place, but, create not a human Mars, but, find some way of responsibly moving ourselves onto Mars. I don't think he could see the future. I don't think he had an actual vision for what that would look like. But I think his words are important to keep in mind as we think about, what could follow Artemis. If this time, once we've been to the moon, we do go on to Mars, we'll have to think, very deeply in a Sagan-like way about how we will go to Mars and what we're going to bring with us and how we're going to change that world.
I was going to save it for the end of the conversation, but it's so appropriate now. I want to mention the very last line in the text of the book. your book with a little tip of the hat to Ray Bradbury, I think. The most important question we can ask now is not how will we go to Mars, but who do we want to be when we become Martians?
Yeah, thanks. I liked that line too.
Me too.
I thought it was a good last line for the book because I thought it was thought provoking, and it also, ties back to all of the previous chapters in that, when we look at these cultures and how they viewed Mars and how they connected it to their lives and their place in the universe, what we were really looking at is who they were, who they understood themselves to be. And so, however we go to Mars, it's going to reflect who we are. And so, yeah, the question that is sort of top of my mind is, if we have this, if we know this about ourselves, then we can do something, deliberate. We can think about who we want to be when we get to Mars and when we become Martians. Like, what are the problems that we want to solve by going to Mars?
Let me go back to our thoughtful friend Luis. He said, a question for later, which must be now. In the last chapter, you mentioned as we aim to explore Mars, we should ensure, oh, you know what, I'm reading these cold, so this may be what you just responded to, that we ensure that we don't make the same mistakes we have made in the past, including our colonialist past. You mentioned that as we have come up with a plan to do this, we need to define a we that is inclusive. To achieve that we, humanity, will have to include all the voices at the table, which means even loud opposing voices. Do you have any worries or concerns about the possibility of this given our current global political stage? And I'm going to throw in there that question that has apparently come from a number of people. If it's appropriate to work it in there, your work on Afrofuturism, or you're writing about it, because I was not aware of that.
Yeah, well, to start with the Afrofuturism, I had the opportunity a few years ago to start working on a collaborative project with curators at the Museum of African American History and Culture, and also the Museum of African Art, that are both part of Smithsonian. Because even though, the Smithsonian is one Smithsonian institution, it's not actually that common that curators from different museums work together on projects. But we saw this opportunity to think about an area that's becoming, very popular in our culture. A lot of art and popular culture are being produced that all three of our museums were interested in, and that was Afrofuturism. And from my perspective as a curator at Air and Space, this was a way to kind of pay attention to narratives about space, narratives about technology that our museum wasn't already paying attention to. And, we know the very classic science fiction stories that have shaped our ideas about spaceflight. You mentioned Bradbury. Bradbury's a big name there. But we maybe haven't paid as much attention in the space history community to these voices that weren't as mainstream. So musicians like Sun Ra and, authors like Octavia Butler or Samuel Delany, very popular authors, but their work has never really been considered by space historians as part of that sort of core imaginative literature. And so I felt like if we engaged in this project, we would be able to bring those voices in and make them part of a narrative that they should have been part of from the beginning. So that's part of that idea, I think, of bringing voices to the table, is broadening our idea of who's writing and thinking about our future in space, and not just looking at the usual suspects. And so Afrofuturism was one way to do that, because I felt like that was a blind spot that our museum had and that space history in general had. And that was a very fun project to be involved with. There's a new exhibition at the Museum of African American History and Culture on Afrofuturism. And they put out a very nice book that accompanies that exhibition called Afrofuturism. I got to write a couple of small essays that are in here about the first Black astronauts, and then also about Nichelle Nichols' portrayal of Uhura. And then there's a lot of other incredible authors and historians who have contributed to this volume. So it's a fun book, and if you get the chance to come to DC and are planning a visit to the Smithsonian, of course, come and see our new galleries at the Air and Space Museum, including our Exploring the Planets gallery. But go to the Museum of African American History and Culture as well, because I think you'll really enjoy the Afrofuturism exhibition, which has a lot to say about spaceflight and technology, and basically another lens through which to view it. So, I think that bringing more voices to the table means thinking in those terms, but I think it also means, literally involving more people in the discussion and encouraging people to participate in the discussion of, how and why we will go to Mars.
And I will throw in a plug for one of my favorite authors, Kim Stanley Robinson, who addressed this theme of creating a multicultural whole on Mars in his famous Mars trilogy. It's one of the nicest themes in the book, I think. And boy, do I highly recommend that other museum. Walk up the mall, up to the other side of the mall, and enjoy the absolutely fantastic African American Museum. Here is a related question from my wonderful colleague, Mark Hilverda at the Planetary Society, who is a big fan of the book club and of your book. I know because he's told me. He also sort of shepherds our journal area of the member community. He says, I had a question related to the same section at the end as Luis, wondering about who might actually be the ones who get to Mars. If corporations get there first, we're talking about you, Elon, could their monetary interests take precedence over equality? Similarly, could one country's interests take control? Basically, if anyone could let us know how all of us humans could get along and get to Mars the right way, that'd be outstanding. Wouldn't it just?
Yeah, wouldn't it? I don't know really how to predict what might happen. It's similar to the problem that we face with the rise of commercial spaceflight, even just in suborbital space, which is this question of it's this incredible development that's allowing more people to go to space, but will it allow everyone to go to space, or is it going to be still limited to people who can afford the trip? And how do we make it more accessible, right? So you could argue that just like any industry, like the aviation industry, in the beginning, it started out in similar ways, and eventually it got even more democratized to where now virtually everyone flies, and we've all experienced being on an airplane. Will the same thing happen in spaceflight? I don't know. And then projecting that even further to sending people to Mars and thinking about what they'll do on Mars, who will profit from what they're doing on Mars, who's doing the work, who's going on vacation to Mars. It becomes really difficult to come up with a prediction of what that's actually going to look like and who's actually going to be involved. I think you're right that Kim Stanley Robinson probably has the most developed version of that story that we've seen. And then there are other examples from science fiction, like one of my favorite recent examples was the series The Expanse, which imagined life on Mars in a more far future version of Martian civilization, where the people who are living on Mars are basically, they've been there for long enough that they think of themselves as Martians, not as people from Earth. And so the politics, that relationship between Mars and Earth, is different from what we might imagine it would be if we were just sending people from the U.S. and from other countries, or people from representing corporations or whatever they may be. So they've gotten well beyond that dependence on the relationship with Earth in the story that's told in The Expanse, and that lends itself to a completely different politics and understanding of social life. So I like comparing those two narratives, the kind of the Kim Stanley Robinson version versus the Expanse version. I think it's really kind of an interesting comparison.
Absolutely fascinating. And I want to continue in this vein. Oh, I'll also mention that maybe it was Robert Heinlein who kind of foresaw this with his terrific classic, Moon is the Harsh Mistress. But to take it a little bit lighter before we wrap up with one last question from Mark, because we are taking a good deal of your time there over on the East Coast.
That's okay.
Thank you. You give Star Trek its deserved due as well, but you made me sorry that I've never seen an episode of Star Trek's great uncle, Space Patrol. I've seen stills from it. I've read about it. I didn't realize that it had such a sophisticated sort of backstory or plotting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting show. I can't say that I've seen all of it. There are episodes that are available on YouTube, and I watched some of them in order to learn enough to write about it here. But I thought it was really interesting. You know, they imagine this kind of utopian vision of humans moving out into space, and they don't inhabit an already existing planet. Instead, they build a new planet, and at the core of that planet is soil from all of the different nations on Earth, right? So it's this kind of idealist utopian vision, maybe influenced by ideas of the United Nations or something like that, of what a peaceful future in space might look like. But then, of course, there are bad guys, and the bad guys live on Mars, of course. So yeah,
it's those noxious vapors that get to them.
Yeah, it must be.
I got one other light one, and it's another expression of gratitude that you included not just one, but two of my one of my heroes, Randall Munroe's terrific comic strips, XKCD, in the book. I mean, Mars may not be a deity, but Randall is at least a semi-deity to me, demigod. Just wonderful work, and it was great to see his stuff in the book.
And he was very, very nice and generous about allowing us to use those cartoons in the book. And you know, I'm a big fan. I've been reading XKCD for a long time, and so I was happy to include those because, you know, sometimes I feel like he's able to express ideas that I can't even articulate through those little comic strips, and always in a very insightful and humorous way. So yeah. I love his work and was very happy to include it.
I don't know anybody else who gets so much out of stick figures.
Yeah, so. I know.
All right, here we go. Our closing question from, again, my colleague, Mark Hilverda. Sorry, I've been saying it wrong for years. Mark Hilverda. Sorry, Mark. Here you go. It seems many people from the time of Lowell and earlier seemed pretty chill with the idea of life on other worlds and expecting it. They seemed fine with it. They expected it. Do you think people today would, or perhaps will, be more affected by the discovery of life beyond Earth now than those of generations ago?
That's a good question. And, you know, a long time ago, or what feels like a long time ago, I was looking at all of these public opinion surveys that have been done over the years of people's beliefs in whether or not there was life in outer space, or, you know, what would the impact be of discovering life on Mars. And I think most of the people who answered those questions, at least, you know, appeared to be kind of nonchalant about it. That, you know, a lot of people thought that it's a good possibility because of what we know about biology. And, you know, whether they believed that life evolved on Earth or if they believed life had been created by a divine creator, either way, they were able to imagine a reason why life might exist on other planets. And so, you know, I think that people are still right when they say that the discovery of life on Mars, or, you know, say on Europa or wherever it is that we may find it, will still be one of the most significant discoveries that's ever been made in the history of science. And it may change our view of ourselves in the universe. But in a lot of ways, the seeds of that change were planted a long time ago. And that we've been thinking about this question for long enough that it's really kind of, you know, become almost not quite passé, but, you know, it's an old question that we now know that we have no reason to believe, right, that it's not out there. Everything we know about science says that if it happened here, it probably happened at least one other place and probably many other places. So I don't think it'll surprise people that there is life out there. I think it will be surprising that we've actually found it. That would probably be the big surprise, because we've gone a long time without finding it.
Matt, I bet like me, you hope you're around when that great discovery happens.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
thank you so much. This has been an absolutely delightful conversation. And thank you to all of you who have joined us here in the member community as well. Of course, we have been talking about For the Love of Mars, A Human History of the Red Planet. If you have not read it and you've enjoyed this conversation, you will enjoy the book even more. So thank you, everyone, once again. And for your questions, when we return with our next live stream here in the book club in the member community, it will be Mars, Packing for Mars from Mary Roach, who I interviewed for Planetary Radio years ago. It was another extremely enjoyable, laugh-filled conversation. And she now has a new edition of the book out for young people, which is just barely out of my reach, Packing for Mars for Kids. We will be talking to her on September 12th. So watch the member community for announcements about that. And then we will be picking up the newest book from another of our co-founders, Dr. Lewis Friedman, the guy who used to head the Mars program at JPL and was my boss at the Planetary Society for many years. His new book that is just about to appear is called Alone But Not Lonely. Fascinating stuff. Matt, thank you for becoming part of this wonderful series of authors that we will continue to feature here. And I look forward to visiting the museum with you sometime and seeing those new galleries, which I haven't made it to yet.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for spending this time with us.
Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful week and weekend. And thank you for joining us here in the book club. Thank you for being part of the Planetary Society. You are the people who make all of this possible. And we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.